All right, I think we are live. Apologies
Perfect.
to everyone in the audience for the technical difficulties, but that is resolved now. Tonight we will be talking to the warrior philosopher about Yukio Mishima. Yukio Mishima is a philosopher who I really think uh, people don't read him enough, and he has some valuable insights, especially for someone with a dissident right, nationalist worldview. Especially for someone. Oh, got an echo there. Okay, so the warrior philosopher, how are you doing tonight?
Doing excellent. Coming live from Mars, actually. Just rode on my chariot to come down here and do this podcast. So very happy to be here.
Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience for anyone who may not know you?
Absolutely. So I'm the Warrior Philosopher. I started my channel about 2 years ago. Started off with kind of the normie stuff, and then started reading Nietzsche and got into dissident right wing talking points from there. I also do Twitter. And I'd say the main mission behind my content is essentially creating a mind body singularity of action and philosophy, hence the name The Warrior Philosopher, which is great for today since Mishima, I think, is uh, one of his biggest, I guess, contributions to dissident right wing thought is this very active and virile philosophical outlook that you get in Sun and Steel and in a lot of his fiction as well, Runaway Horses, where it's the combination of the will and the philosopher with action. Of course, Mishima himself is an avid bodybuilder and martial artist, and he did the Japanese Defense Forces basic training. He strove to be a warrior, he strove to be a samurai, a complete human being, because you could be a great soldier, but you could also be fighting for the wrong causes. So you need to know what you're fighting for, otherwise you just end up, being used by globalists, let's say, quote unquote, and so on and so forth. And but yeah, that's my channel. Warrior philosopher, building strong minds, strong bodies, and hopefully imparting a new cultural renaissance as we go forward in the future.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that assessment. And I think you touched on something important when you said soldiers who don't know what they're fighting for will end up fighting for the wrong causes. And I'm sure that the American and, well, the Allied soldiers from World War II are seeing that from beyond the grave now. But let's get into Mishima. So, the first question I had here for you is who was Yukio Mishima? And in your opinion, what does he have to offer to us today?
So Yukio Mishima started off as a very famous writer in Japan. His first major work came out when he was 24. So he was very young when he started becoming successful, and he was very much a celebrity writer. He was renowned in Japan, and then once his books started being translated, renowned throughout the world. But what is perhaps more important to talk about with Mishima is the transition in his life that takes place, I believe, in the late 50s when he takes a trip to Greece and he witnesses Greek architecture and, of course, the Greek statues. And he realizes the physical ideal that the Greeks had sought. And something I talk about in a lot of my videos is that the Greeks' view of beauty and aesthetics comes from a place of violence, because what is beautiful is often also good at violence. The lion is beautiful because he is the premier apex predator in the savannah. So what Mishima realizes is that these ideals that he might have been been hinting at throughout his whole life, or at least that he
For a
might have felt
second.
drawn towards. Oh, sorry, what was that? Never mind. I thought I heard something. But so what these things that he's drawn towards early in his life, like philosophy and so on and so forth, he realizes that ideas and ideals mean nothing without a physical manifestation to back them up. So of course he begins bodybuilding. He begins practicing martial arts. He does the Japanese Defense Forces basic training, and he forms his own militia, the Tatenokai, which is the Shield Society, who are sworn to defend the emperor. So what Mishima really is of course, he begins as a celebrity writer, but then he becomes a total human being. He becomes a samurai almost, and of course, he does come from samurai lineage, and he pursues the path of sun and steel. He becomes a warrior, and in 1970, on November 25th, he leads himself and I believe four of his Tatsunokai followers, and they storm the Japanese Defense Forces headquarters in Tokyo, and they take the base commandant hostage, and they force him to call the garrison out, and Mishima addresses the garrison and essentially attempts to incite a coup d'etat to restore the Emperor of Japan to his position as a total ruler and an actual divine god, at least in the eyes of the Japanese. So what Mishima is of course, he's a fantastic writer. He's a very great thinker. He's a philosopher, but he's also very much a warrior. He's a total human being, and he's a cultural revolutionary against the decadence of modernity. And I think that's why people appreciate him so much today, is because Mishima himself suffered from many of the ills of modernity. He wasn't a perfect person. He dealt with a lot of corruption and impurity. And he saw this also in modernity, and he saw that the only way to combat that was this sort of return to a more vital way of life, which, in one way or another can be described as the warrior's way of life, or in his case, the samurai. So it's this revolt against, if we're going to bring out Evolan terminology. But yeah, that's sort of a brief introduction into Mishima without getting too long-winded.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. I think you may find this interesting is I actually wrote a research paper on Yukio Mishima for college. We had to do an assignment, and I wanted to just, let me go back for a second. So I was in this very liberal, like libtard history class, and we were just getting all of this bad filth taught to us. And I wanted to write a really based research paper. So I decided, I think I'll write about Mishima. And specifically, I wrote about, his failed coup attempt and the reasons why he carried that out. And I actually have two quotes here from the speech he gave on the balcony to the Japanese self-defense forces. And I think these two quotes are important for any nationalist, regardless of your country. Because basically, Mishima is making the same arguments that even National Socialists in Germany after 1945 would have made. So I think I'll begin by reading one of the quotes, and then we can discuss that quote, and then we'll do the same for the second, and we'll just examine why Mishima decided to launch this coup attempt. Does that sound good with you?
It sounds good to me.
Awesome. So the first quote we have here is from his speech called A Call to Arms, which was in 1970. He says, "The post-war Japan has wallowed in economic prosperity, forgotten the fundamentals of a nation, lost its national spirit, neglected the essentials in pursuit of trifles, engaged in makeshift and hypocrisy, and itself is falling into the blankness of the soul. This is what we, referring to the Shield Society, saw." So what do you think of that first quote from Mishima?
Well, I think that Japan, one of the things that really takes place hard during 1946 to about the early 50s is that the American forces occupying Japan are really trying to hammer down this expulsion of certain sentiments of Japanese nationalism and of their previous warrior culture. So I believe things such as like many katanas were confiscated, for example. Imagery that invoked their warrior past was banned. They really, in many ways, were trying to castrate the Japanese people. And of course, they're trying to replace this cultural strength of character that the Japanese had with something material. So of course, Japan today, for instance, is very much westernized. You see all this like anime or these weird things I don't even want to talk about. But like there's a lot of weird consumerism in Japan now, and a lot of that began in 1946 with a concerted effort by the American government to essentially get rid of this warrior past culturally in Japan. So what you're talking about in that quote is absolutely correct. And essentially, I think what it demonstrates is that the Japanese people have lost their way. They've been, like I said, literally castrated of their warrior past in many ways. And Mishima believes that without a real push to return to that, that they're just going to end up like the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the developed world or the liberal world. Because ultimately the goal of a like new liberal world order is to ensure that every other country is liberal. And I think the hallmark of liberalism is a lack of a real central identity. Your identity goes from something cultural to something entirely material. So, for example, why movies like Fight Club are so popular is because the whole point of Fight Club is this man, right? This violent, beautiful creature who should be expressing his will to power is turned into an IKEA nesting furniture goblin, right? He's turned into this, porn addicted, fat or too skinny guy. And I think that's precisely what Mishima's sort of alluding to is this great chasm of materialism swallowing spirituality and swallowing culture, which was the driving force, religion and culture as the driving force of identity, now being replaced with this liberal materialism, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I would say that the Judeo-American Empire, when it defeated Germany and it defeated Japan, it came in with the intent of making these peoples hate their identity. We clearly saw this with Germany, how every aspect of German culture was vilified. But it even also happened in Japan. Like you said, they confiscated those shorter katanas. The emperor was not in his rightful place. And Mishima talks about how the Japanese military, it had this strong samurai tradition, and it was just reduced to a self-defense force that was gelded, you could say. So I think that actually brings us into the second quote from A Call to Arms, which I want to mention. And this quote reads, "Politics is devoted solely to embellishing contradictions, politicians' self-preservation, power grabs, and hypocrisy. Matters of vital and lasting importance are being entrusted to a certain foreign country. The humiliation of the war defeat has never been fully examined or erased, but was just muddled through, and the Japanese themselves are, are defiling the history and traditions of Japan."
Yeah, and before I go into that point, it's worth noting what happened to Japan happened twice as bad in Germany. At least in Japan today, they won't talk about the Battle of Nanking, for instance. They won't talk about some of the quote unquote war crimes. And of course, definitionally they were war crimes, but of course war crimes are committed throughout human history. The sacking of Troy was a war crime, but we celebrate that as a victory of stronger men over the weaker. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, Germany received it to a much worse degree than Japan. They really had everything sucked out of them culturally. But to go to your point regarding politics, I think that the two things I thought about right away actually is more so a critique of democracy, which I think when we talk about the political today or politics as it exists today, we're generally referring to liberal democratic politics. So two interesting things. So first, I think that Evola's critique of politics and his assertion of the apolitical is interesting because it's not an assertion that you should not be involved in the political. It's a argument against this sort of parliamentary style rule that we have today, which goes into the next thing I want to talk about, which is Carl Schmitt's critique of democratic politics, and he talks about factionalism and how you have all these different political classes and factions that are fighting for their interest, not the interest of the actual collective, which is the state or the government or the country. They're fighting for power politically so that they can further represent their interests. And Mishima writes about is the February 26th incident, where the young officers of the Japanese army tried to revolt against the government because of the Zaibatsu. The bankers and the industrialists were to the rest of the world in one way or another. And of course, Once the war takes place, nationalism sort of rises up again. But for a little while, these bankers and industrialists were gaining power in Japan. And what happens when this takes place is you have people that no longer care for the good or the power or the strength of the actual country, but themselves. And when everybody starts, let's take the central government for instance. When you have 5 different factions, all with their own interests, all of which are material, all of which are for that particular politician's benefit, or maybe a foreign interest, for instance, maybe something like a certain special action committee in the United States. Once that becomes uh, the motivation to gain political power, then there is no central driving force moving forward. It's all these hands grabbing at the center and pulling it towards them. So you have no concerted direction for the country or the state to go towards. So essentially, it's a critique by Mishima, I believe, of the liberal democracy that replaced this unity of government, which for the most part existed with the emperor. And like I said, there were issues with the Zaibatsu, for instance, that got a little bit too much influence, but still there was this center, right, that could orient the country in a certain direction. But with liberal democracy, there is no orientation anywhere. It's just all these different arrows pointing in different directions, all for material gain. And I believe that's generally what he's getting at there.
Yeah, I guess we could say the only thing liberal democracy is oriented is whatever benefits Israel. That seems to be really the raison d'etre of democracy. So I also want to get into Mishima's failed coup. So he led 4 members of the Shield Society after taking his base commander hostage, and then he delivered his speech, A Call to Arms, to the assembled Japanese self-defense forces. Now, when I was researching my research paper for Mishima last semester, there was a lot of online debate over whether Mishima knew that this would fail or whether he actually thought it would succeed. And I actually want to get your opinion before I explain my point of view. So, do you think Mishima knew that his plan wouldn't work?
I think he likely knew that it was a very, very, very low probability, which I think actually adds to the greatness of the decision to go through with that. Ultimately, what the coup was, it was a political act of rebellion against the new order of Japan and of course the world by extension, if you look into it. It was a political revolt against that, but it was also this manifestation of all the ideals that he held dear. He, in many of his work, basically the recurring theme in his works, it's very similar to the sort of choice of Achilles in the Iliad, right? And in the final lines of Man and Technics, Oswald Spengler says something along the lines of, "It's better to choose the short life full of content than the long life without it." And essentially what that means is it's better to have lived a life where you maximize your will to power, where you live greatly and beautifully, where you risk your life. You might see death, but you do it for glory, so to speak, rather than getting old and being comfortable and dying in some hospital. And of course, in many of Mishima's interviews, he says in the modern age there is no heroic death, right? He talks about people dying in their hospital beds. I forget where this particular quote is. I'm thinking maybe Sun and Steel, but he says the average age for the Greek was 18, for the Roman 21. How beautiful heaven must have been then. And he saw himself aging, and he saw himself growing weaker because he was about 40, I believe, when, or 35, let's see, 1925 to 1970, so I guess 35. Or am I tripping here? No, 45, Jesus. 45, so I believe. Yes, 1970, 25. So he's reaching that point in his life where he's going to start going downhill. He's going to start to get weaker. He start to get frail. He's going to go towards that death that he is so critical of, the death of the old man strapped to all these IVs, over medicated. He doesn't want that death. He wants the beautiful young death. And in the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, which is, in my opinion, his best his best works of fiction. Um, there's one, the sort of main character of the tetralogy is this man named Honda. I forget his first name, but Honda starts off as this very virtuous character in his youth, but as the series goes on, he becomes more and more corrupt and disgusting and old and decrepit. And all of the heroes of the tetralogy series died young and died in very beautiful and terrific ways. Um, so I think that Mishima knew that not only was it a political act, right, to sort of light a torch which might inspire the future of resistance against this world order, and a torch to inspire future Japanese nationalists, and so on and so forth. But it was also a manifestation of his art. His art was all about choosing the glorious but short flame over the old, decrepit, decadent sort of existence. And I think that's so in this case, him knowing that perhaps his chances of success were very low, it didn't matter, because what mattered to Mishima was that he lived up to the ideals he wrote about. What mattered to Mishima was he sacrificed himself so that in the future, people like you and I could be inspired by his actions. So I do think that he probably was almost certainly going in there knowing he's going to die that day. And even if he did succeed, it's very likely he still would have committed seppuku, because, you know, with Japanese culture, it's very interesting. So, for example, in 47 Ronin, even after succeeding in their mission, they all killed themselves. So Mishima might have killed himself anyway. But that's a little long-winded answer, but I hope that sort of clarifies my position a bit.
No, you're totally fine. And I actually arrived at a similar conclusion when I was writing my research paper. I cited Sun and Steel and how Mishima had specific views on death, where, like you said, he wanted to die at his physical apex rather than dying a decrepit old man who's frail and ill and with a flabby body. So Mishima wanted to die at the best part of his life because he thought it would be more heroic and more tragic, you could say. And the other thing I came across when I was researching this paper is one of my sources told me that no one in Japan had died by seppuku since the Second World War. And there were even a few years from 1945 to 1970 where it was illegal, maybe not across the whole of Japan, but in certain prefectures it was. I can't exactly remember. So Mishima was really making a statement with his death, and I think he knew that going into it. He knew that this coup probably wouldn't succeed, but it wasn't about being a successful revolutionary. It was about dying a noble death and making a statement while doing it. So the next question I wanted to ask you regarding Yukio Mishima is, what books have you read from Mishima, and do you have a particular favorite?
Absolutely. So I'll actually walk the viewers through how I went about it. So I read Sound of Waves first, which is a little bit random, but essentially I had heard of Mishima, and I went to the my local Barnes and Noble. Yes, very cringe place. But I was still in the military at the time, and the Barnes and Noble was next to a military base, and they actually curate their books based on the local consumers. So of course the books were pretty based because it was near a military base. So lots of war stuff. But it was one of the books that I saw by Mishima that were being sold, so I bought Sound of Waves. Very unique Mishima book because it's not tragic. It's actually quite a simple sort of little love story in a classical Japanese village. But I started with Sound of Waves, then I read Sun and Steel, which of course I loved very much, and I recommend that as the first read. Here's the thing about Sun and Steel. You can't know Mishima just by reading Sun and Steel, and there's a lot of people that think they know everything about Mishima after reading it. It's not sufficient, but it's a very good place to start, and I think the ideal place to start. And then after that, I actually went on a short deployment in the Western Pacific. One of the places I went to was Japan, and I read the entire tetralogy of the Sea of Fertility. So that's Spring Snow, Runaway Horses, Temple of Dawn, and then Decay of the Angel. And I will say that my favorite is probably Runaway Horses. That's probably my favorite, just because I think it's very, if you read Runaway Horses and you follow the storyline, you see where all these inspirations for Mishima's philosophical positions in Sun and Steel come from. The young death rather than the old one, this fascination with death, this fascination with purity. So the Sea of Fertility tetralogy as a whole is very good. Runaway Horse is my favorite. Besides those, later on I've read Sailor Who Fell from Grace from the Sea, which is very well written. I wouldn't say it's my favorite just because the storyline, in my opinion, is not the most interesting, but that's just me. And then I've read Temple of Dawn, which is in the Mishima film. It's the first uh, book that's covered in the film, and of course, Runaway Horses is in there as well. Let's see. I think that's it for books, and of course, I've read a good few of his shorter stuff, like Patriotism is very good. But I believe those are the books I've read by him. But yeah, Runaway Horses, my favorite, and of course, you can't go wrong with Sun and Steel.
Very interesting. I personally haven't read Runaway Horses. I have read one of his plays, though, titled My Friend Hitler. And I really enjoyed this play because when Mishima wrote it, he was responding to critics who said, oh, Yukio Mishima can't write male characters. He sucks at writing male characters. So Mishima took umbrage with that and decided to write a play about four male characters, which were Hitler, Ernst Röhm, Gregor Strasser, and then Gustav Krupp. And the play is really a dramatization of the Night of the Long Knives when the National Socialists purged their ranks of degenerates like Ernst Röhm. I have a video of reviewing that play. If anyone wants to watch that, it's in my back catalog. So my question for you, the Warrior Philosopher, is have you read this play? And if so, what do you think of it?
Yeah, I haven't read the play, but I know of it, and I sort of familiar with the gist of it. And I think from what I remember reading about it, aside from the things you mentioned, is it's this sort of I think he was trying to make a statement clearly. You know, I think the post-war, the sentiment of the post-war still very strong. There's this very singular view of good and evil, and I think perhaps it was um, Mishima attempting to say, well, actually, let's look at it deeper. And of course, Mishima is interesting because early on he had a very diverse fan base of right and left wing people. And after he started weightlifting, a warning to all young men: the moment you start weightlifting, you will become fascist. You have no choice, you know. But after he starts weightlifting is when he starts writing more right wing, and of course his left wing fans start to move away a little bit. So I think that's him putting a stamp saying, no, I'm defiantly right wing. I'll stand by my principles. And of course Mishima says stuff like, oh, right wing, left wing, I'm pro violence, but he is a right wing character, and I think that the way I define the right, at least, he was very much right wing. And I think, like I said, I haven't read the play, but from what I know about it, it seems to me him putting his stamp on his convictions and saying, I don't care what you think, this is what I believe. And that I think is cool.
For sure. I've read the play. Again, you can check it out in my back catalog. It's a dramatization, so it's not a history report. If you want that, watch someone like Zoomer Historian. But I still think it has value, even though it's a narrative rather than a actual recording of what happened. So, when you were touching on leftists and their aversion to physical fitness, and how fitness is a right wing trait, we can even look at articles online and they'll say that gyms are places of white supremacy, which they should be. But I wanted to ask you more about Mishima's relevance to the gym. Obviously, I'm a huge proponent of exercise. We all need to be as fit as we can to, well, better our people. So, what do you think Mishima has to offer to someone who's maybe starting out in the gym or maybe an intermediate lifter? Is there any insights or philosophy that these people should be aware of, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, when somebody, for example, who is a leftist or a self-described communist is physically fit. They're physically fit not because they're a leftist, but in spite of being a leftist, right? Because there's no reason to be physically aesthetic or beautiful as a leftist, because the whole principle on a spiritual level, of course, is this sort of enforced egalitarianism, right? It's this lack of distinction. Well, distinction is bad, whereas going to the gym is all about distinction. It's all about, if I put in more work or if I have better genetics, I'm going to look better than you, right? It's all about inequality. And I think what makes the right is because it is an enforcement of inequality over time. It is whichever peoples conquer another peoples win, right? And of course, I think the famous thing that people are always talking about regarding race and slavery, for instance, is that every race has been enslaved, but only certain races talk about being enslaved. And I think that comes from the fact that, you as a people might be down today, but you will get your revenge in the future, perhaps. You'll end up on top in the future. And it's the peoples that were never on top that generally have the biggest issue with slavery, right? The people who never colonized. Because most people in history have colonized. But to have never colonized and only have been colonized, of course, you're going to adopt this sort of Nietzschean ressentiment, this Nietzschean slave morality of, oh, well, actually, colonization is bad. And I think that goes into the gym. It may seem like two totally different things, but when we talk about, well, does the gym make me fascist or whatever, or does the gym make me right wing? It's because it's enforcing natural inequality that comes from a combination of inborn traits and also comes from work that you put in. It comes from your will. Who has a stronger will? Who has the greater will to power? So if you worship beauty, which I think people should, it's the same as worshiping power. Too often today, people ethnically want to associate with being colonized or being oppressed. And I think this is why, unfairly, of course, that the Irish get so much hate, is because a lot of Irish sentiment is built upon a hatred of the Anglo because they were colonized, right? And you see this more predominantly, of course, in Africa, for instance, or certain parts of Latin America. Maybe it's mainly Africa. We were colonized, so we're going to make it seem like being colonized was a good thing. We were defeated, but we were mistreated, whatever. It's the same thing that these body positivity people have with the whole, like, oh, it's okay to be fat, or it's okay not to be physically fit. It's all a cope for not being strong in the case of colonialization, or not being physically strong in the case of the gym. So it all comes down to every people in history have had their moment. But if you were a people that never had your moment, then you're going to act like that's not that important, right? If you have no great history of conquest to celebrate, you're going to act like celebrating it is bad. And it's the same thing with the gym. If you cannot be strong or physically beautiful, or more importantly, you feel like you cannot, then you're going to act like it doesn't make sense, or like, oh, it's stupid. So that's I guess, I like to give long-winded answers, I guess, but I hope that kind of answers your question.
No, you're totally welcome to give long-winded answers. It's what the podcast is for. I think you touched on two things in your response that I want to dive deeper into. The first is when you said that you can't keep a great culture down. I think this is true, and this should be a cause of hope for white people in the West. We're currently, how shall I say, we're currently kept down by a certain Middle Eastern tribe from Tel Aviv, but time is cyclical. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. So I think just because the West is down right now, it won't stay like this forever. We are building, it's up to us. It's our duty to be the strong people who return the West to greatness in each of our countries. So I definitely agree with that sentiment. And it's also a great antidote to the black pill. I'm very against black pilling on this channel. The second thing you talked about, which I want to dive deeper into, is the worship of beauty. This is a very Nietzschean concept that you brought up. I think Nietzsche wrote somewhere in his books that, like, people will cry over accidentally killing a butterfly, but no one sheds a tear if they accidentally step on a centipede or some gross insect. And he used this as an example to say that beauty is an aspect of morality. The beautiful is good. We should worship beauty. So if you would like to delve deeper into any of those two subjects, feel free.
Yeah, so the sentiment with that is very much true. For that specific aphorism, I've actually tried to find it in Nietzsche's writings before. I think it's more likely an interpretation of one of his other aphorisms because I haven't been able to find that in his works. So I'm not sure specifically if that's like something he wrote or not, but it's absolutely something that encapsulates his position, right? This sort of aesthetic metaphysics, I guess, so to speak, this belief in the higher spirit being the one of higher beauty. And when I say worship beauty, to me there's no difference between beauty and power, not really. If you think about what is power? Power is essentially being able to control your environment. And to do that, you need to be skilled at violence or skilled at living, first of all. And if you look at most of the things that we consider beautiful, there is an element of violence attached to those beautiful things. This is true of most beautiful things. They're also violent. Even something as simple as the sun. Well, why do we find the sun beautiful? Well, the sun is something both to be worshipped and to be feared, right? Without the sun, we would not exist. But at the same time, the sun can beat down upon you and sort of cast a dangerous ray upon you in the desert or whatever. It's like something to be respected. The lion, like I mentioned earlier, is beautiful because it is powerful. It encapsulates will to power. It asserts itself on the world around it. The Greek sculpture is beautiful because that sort of body is necessary to conquer your enemies. And in regards to Western civilization, right, I think it's interesting because if you read, for example, Spengler, right, the era of the West currently, which he believed is coming to an end, is the Faustian era. And a lot of people see Spengler as a black pillar, like, oh, it's so over. But I think what's worth noting with Western civilization as a whole is that there are many iterations of Western civilization, right? And in those iterations, there were different peoples on top. At one point, it was the Romans. At one point, it was the British and the Anglos. At one point, it was even the French. Um, and if you go back far enough, I mean, you have to look at the times that the West fell in one regard, but then rose up stronger. So, for example, uh, when we look at the steppe peoples, for instance, who weren't always in Europe, right? Of course, originally you have the Longhouse societies, which Bap sort of writes about, and of course the Yamnaya come in and conquer. And those people at the time might have been like, well, it's so over. But then afterwards, the Yamnaya become, eventually, over time, become the Hellenes, right? Specifically the Dorians. I think the Mycenaeans, which are the Athenians, are a little bit different. Um, they become the pagan gods, for instance, they come from, the sort of, I believe, is the Pontic Caspian steppe specifically. Um, but that was an iteration of a very early iteration of the West, going through this rebirth by fire. And of course, there must have been much death and carnage and destruction, but then it rose again stronger. A new aristocracy was built up. From that root, the Romans come about. Or even if you read the Aeneid, which of course is historically, how true is it? I don't know. Achilles is real. We are not, right? But with the Aeneid, the story goes that Aeneas, who was a Trojan lord, he was the cousin of Hector, and therefore the nephew of Priam, the king of Troy, and he was the son of Aphrodite. After Troy was ruined and sacked, and all the babies were thrown off the walls, and the women were raped and enslaved or killed, Aeneas alone must carry on the torch of Troy. And the legendary history says that he has this big sort of almost like an odyssey, very similar to Odysseus and the Odyssey. He goes through all these different places. He even ends up in Carthage. Uh, Queen Dido falls in love with him, and when he leaves, she kills herself, and that's supposed to be the legendary origins of the Carthaginian Roman rivalry. And he finally ends up in modern day Italy, right? And he founds the Latin people, which will eventually become Romulus and Remus, and eventually will found Rome. But the point I'm trying to illustrate is just because, quote unquote, it's so over, and one iteration of the West might have fallen. For the Romans, they were Spengler considers them the sort of Western period of antiquity, right? And afterwards, you have the Faustian. Just because one iteration falls in one specific form does not mean it will not rise again stronger in some other form. And it may not be exactly the same. Uh, you know, of course, the Faustian West is not exactly the same as Rome, but is inspired by it. Even the Anglos are inspired by the Med. They're inspired by Rome and its heraldry. Every great empire tries to be like Rome in some way or another. The French, even the Third Reich, right? You have, the Eagle Standard was very similar to the Roman Eagle Standard, or, for example, with fascist Italy, of course, which makes a little more sense because Italy, in Italy, Rome, that makes sense. But for the other ones, it's more profound. They see that as inspiration, and of course, the past of the West is inspiring the future. But just because one specific iteration of the West falls, it does not mean that the West itself is dead. It just needs to be rebuilt in a different way. And it may look different, but it's still vital and it's still strong and it still has that will. So I can't even remember what the original question was because I kind of went off a little bit. So I guess I'll just end that there.
No, I'm glad you went off because I think you were really hitting on something at the end. The question was about beauty and what we think of that, but I think like uh, if you take a civilization like ancient Rome, for example, it was very beautiful, and the reason it's such a tragedy that Rome fell was because all of its beauty, its culture, its architecture, its language, they all were stomped out. But that does not mean that the people who lived in Rome just evaporated and were never seen again. We still have Italians, at least northern Italians, like to carry on the Roman legacy, from what I understand. If you take a civilization like the Third Reich, for example, it was truly special because it was beautiful. It encouraged physical excellence. It stomped out pornography. It eliminated stuff like race mixing and all of these disgusting behaviors that plague our society. And women in the Third Reich, for example, they weren't going around all tatted up with nose rings, just hooking up with 100 people like that Lily Phillips character in Britain did a few weeks ago. So that's why I think Nietzsche, if I don't know if he said that, but if one of his aphorisms is that the beautiful is moral, I totally agree with that. And I think even if he didn't say it, he would agree with that too. So moving away from beauty and going back to Sun and Steel, I wanted to talk to you about the idea of hero worship, because this is one concept that Yukio Mishima touches on in Sun and Steel. I have the quote here, and I think I'll read it out in a second, but I want to let you explain first. What are your views on hero worship, and why do you think that the left and the Jews hate hero worship so much?
Well, hero worship on a sort of macro level is giving your youth people that they should emulate. Who you portray as heroes to the youth is who they will attempt to emulate. And one thing I talked about in a recent podcast I was on Antipodean Faust's podcast, Agora. And I talked about how today the hero that at least American kids, and I'm not sure if you're from America also, so maybe you're
Yes,
familiar
from
with this as well.
Appalachia.
Okay, gotcha. So you'll be, well, I don't know if because the education system there might be a little different, but where I was, so I was from California, so of course I get the far left version, but the person who we were told should be a hero, or like was should be our hero, was essentially MLK. And what that does is you're putting somebody who was not a warrior, who was not a conqueror, who was not somebody that would have been celebrated for most of human history, as a position in a position of influence over young minds. Then you're taught, well, somebody who is oppressed, for instance, is a hero. Somebody who, quote unquote, is treated unfairly, rather than, well, actually, what we should be emulating are people who are strong, who are powerful, who are beautiful. I think that one of the most base things you can do is put up a statue of Genghis Khan and Ulaanbaatar as a Mongolian. They don't give a fuck, you know. They celebrate their greatest hero, despite the fact that words like war criminal or monster attached to him. Well, he was a strong man who built an empire and increased his people's strength. That is somebody who should be our hero. Or in the West, for instance, we worship men like Caesar, who strove to be great, who extended the Roman borders into Gaul and even temporarily in Britannia. That is who. Those are the kind of people that societies need to worship. They need to worship the members of their society that made their country or their empire stronger, not people who made it weaker. People don't realize MLK was a communist essentially and was very subversive, right? And you know, I'm definitely not the most extreme person on the right when it comes to, like, well, this person or that person needs to be held at the top and so on and so forth. I think that as as we go forward in history, uh, heroes emerge in different varieties. Of course, Mishima himself is not a conqueror in the traditional sense, right? So, as Americans, here's an interesting thing as well. Who do you worship as an American, right? Because you can worship Washington, of course, and you worship great men like Patton. But today, who do you have to look up to? And well, who do we have to look up to? The youth are taught to look up to MLK. And the precedent that sends is that you should not seek to be strong, but you should seek to be just. And well, what is justice, right? And then you just confuse all these young minds with all these different things. Hero worship is worshiping strength, beauty, and power. It is not worshiping weakness. It is not worshiping being at the bottom. It is worshiping being at the top. So, you know, that's sort of a long-winded thing again, but I think that historically, right, who you should worship is who makes your people stronger. And of course, that's why I mentioned colonialization, right? Most people in history have colonized. Most people in history have subjugated other peoples. I think that that's what should be celebrated, right? If you are Mongolian, you should celebrate Genghis Khan. If you are French, you should celebrate Charlemagne or Napoleon. If you're an Anglo, you should celebrate one of, well, with the British imperial history, there's just so many different figures. I can't name one specific one. Let's say you celebrate William the Con or Henry V. There's a good example. You celebrate Henry V, the warrior king, um, so on and so forth, right? If you're Spanish, you celebrate Cortez. You need to celebrate the people in your societies that made your people stronger, not the ones that detracted from it, not the ones that tried to subvert will to power, not those who were themselves weak, who were themselves not able to exert their will to power without subversion, right? So that's what hero worship is to me. It's who do you tell your youth specifically, right? And by extension, when they grow up, the people as a whole, who do you tell your youth they should be like? That's what hero worship is. So what you need to do as the sort of orchestrators of your society is you need to put on a pedestal the people who made your state stronger, the people who made your society stronger. And that is why, you sort of allude to, well, which peoples aren't celebrating their history of being conquerors? Well, it's the people who never conquered, right? And of course, in regards to Israel specifically, ethnically, the original Hebrews, compared to the Ashkenazi, so the modern Palestinian is actually more ethnically related to the original Hebrews than the modern Ashkenazi are, which is interesting because the whole sort of legitimacy, quote unquote, of Israel comes from claiming to have an ancestral homeland. So the original Hebrews who fought against the Philistines, right, who actually were warriors, right, the modern Israeli state does not descend from them. Very little. You might get like a small percentage, but it's nowhere near being able to say, well, this is our ancestral homeland. So of course, why aren't they Why aren't they celebrating being conquerors? Well, because they weren't conquerors, right? So pretty much every people in the world has had a history of being brutal and of being quote unquote evil by sort of liberal modern standards. Um, but those who never had their time in the sun tend to be the ones that that do want to sort of embody the slave morality, that want to embody the morality of, well, it's actually bad to conquer, it's bad to colonize. And I think that's sort of my answer, what you were alluding to earlier with which specific peoples sort of want to subvert this will to power.
Yeah, and I think I'll read this quote out from Mishima because Mishima, when he's talking about leftists, for example, and how they decry hero worship, why they oppose the great man theory of history, he points out that they themselves are physically inadequate and spiritually inadequate as well, but also very physically inadequate. So I'll go ahead and read this quote from page 41 of Sun and Steel. He says, "The cynicism that regards all hero worship as comical is always shadowed by a sense of physical inferiority. Invariably, it is the man who believes himself to be physically lacking in heroic attributes who speaks mockingly of the hero. And when he does so, how dishonest is it that his phraseology, partaking ostensibly of a logic so universal and general, should not, or at least should not be assumed by the general public not to, give any clue to his physical characteristics. I have yet to hear hero worship mocked by a man endowed with what might rightly be called heroic physical attributes. Facile cynicism, invariably, is related to feeble muscles or obesity, while the cult of the hero and a mighty nihilism are always related to the mighty body and well-tempered muscles." So I think Mishima was a little verbose in that quote, but his point is generally correct. The left do not feel physically adequate. They know that they're either obese or they're scrawny or they have some kind of deficiency, and they seek to tear down the hero and just ruin everything he's worked for because of that resentment. Uh, and the right doesn't do this. The true right, that is. The true right strives to be the Ubermensch and does not exhibit this resentment. So, you have any thoughts on that quote that you would like to share?
Yeah, uh, of course, it's exactly as you say. This is the sort of personification of resentment. That he who does not feel he can be powerful will turn power into an evil, right? Which is of course also Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. Uh, but in regards to sort of the general conversation we've been having today, what distinguishes the left and the right, and why historically there has been a certain push against right wing activities. And, we bring up Israel, for instance. And what's interesting, I think, and I think culturally, why we see this sort of, this fear of the right is because, largely Judaism operates off of generally a sort of merchant way of life. When we talk about, okay, well, why do you think power is bad or why is power evil, right? It's always the people without power saying it. So, of course, unity in a state is not good if you yourself don't have a state. If you yourself don't have a state and you benefit, for example, through uh, material trade, right? You want a weak central government with weak identity, which you can exploit economically. So I always say when it comes to, I'll just say quote unquote the question of Israel. Of course, there is a different word perhaps to be used, but to me, it is largely tied to the religious expression of Judaism, I think. And some people on the right may disagree with me, but I think that so when Nietzsche's plan was, which I think was interesting, and of course a lot of people critique Nietzsche for this. His plan was to essentially get to the point where for one generation, you create a shit ton of Mishlings, and then the next generation, there just is no more distinct like Ashkenazi ethnic group, right? It's completely absorbed because largely their ethnic expression has been largely inbred because they kept, uh, within the family, so to speak, and a lot of people in the DR, like I said, are critical of Nietzsche for saying this, but I think that honestly, the way that you break this hegemony um, that you sort of see is through taking that distinct identity away, right, culturally, because you have this religion which essentially revolves around a merchant way of life in the case of, let's just say, the Israelis, right? I personally think that the solution with that specifically is just to get rid of that specific religion, um, and then absorb that specific group to essentially what you have to do is you can't allow, right, this continued thing with APAC, where it's a very small cabal of people that have all this influence, right, without a real physical expression of power. These are perhaps 20 million people globally, 30 million people max, right? Um, if tomorrow their central identity as a religious group didn't exist, and if tomorrow they did not have this very tight knit uh, ethnic sort of thing, which exists, right? Like I said, a lot of them have had, there's been a lot of cousin marriages, so on and so forth. They have a very distinct genetic code. If tomorrow, which was Nietzsche's plan essentially, get rid of the religion and absorb, he wanted to absorb them into Germany, right? He wanted just to create a shit ton of Mishlings for one generation. The next generation, they're gone. And some people would consider that, a bad mix or whatever. But I think largely the expression that they have culturally can get can sort of be eliminated if you essentially what conquest is, right? When one people conquers another people, so to speak. Essentially, what they do is you eventually get to the point where you, the majority, just absorb that group that you conquered. That's how the imperial system, you know, works in some regards if you have the population size to do it. But you know, I guess what I'm trying to get at is in regards to the quote unquote Israeli question. My issue is with this religious cultural force that they have, right? As opposed to this very bare, I don't think like, I don't believe ethnically, right? Like these people are going to, I don't believe, once, essentially what I'm saying is, I think they ought to, basically, you have to conquer them with breeding, right? You have to essentially absorb all these people. You need to break up their central identity, which is the religious cultural group that they have, and you just need to swallow them into your group. You need to conquer them. And a lot of people disagree with me there, but I think that the current strategy, right, of trying to you can't separate them, right? You have Israel now as a country where they're supposed to have their homeland, and they still have such a strong uh, control of global politics. What you need to do is you as America, well, if Israel's existence completely relies upon American aid, you say, okay, tomorrow we're going to essentially annex your country. We're going to send a shit ton of Americans there. We're going to take all your women and create Mishlings. I don't know. I'm half kidding, of course, but in regards to like all this issue with, well, what makes the right, what makes the left, and well, how do you um, expand a right wing worldview? I think that you just need to get rid of all these institutions, all these specific identities, which are an antithesis to the natural order of things, the natural will to power. You don't allow them to continue. You don't allow them to prosper. They prosper so long as you have a system that operates under material exchange, which is why, they've been so powerful recently. I don't think it's an issue so much of them as an ethnic force. I think you could very easily absorb them as an ethnic force, and they would have no more. They would have no more. What do you call it? it would have no more power anymore. But I could be wrong. But I think that's the solution is get rid of the religious cultural group, and you do that by essentially breaking up their distinct identity and just swallowing them. But like I think one of the people looked at one of the comments says many tried to swallow them and they proved to be indigestible. So he might be right, but I guess time will tell.
Well, this is an area where we would have some disagreement because I believe that it absolutely is an ethnic thing. The bagel people, I'll just say that for YouTube. The bagel people are intrinsically subversive. It's just how they are, and they really just rot another people's civilization from the inside out. And they have a specific animus against the European peoples, and that's why they're so hell bent on, destroying Europe. I have some solutions to that, but I will not go on to explain them in this platform for obvious reasons. So that brings us to the end of the questions I had for you. Would you like to shill any of your content, and do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'd say in terms of shilling, I do have a book that's coming out soon, which I'm going to be disseminating to the legionaries in my audience, called Promethean Dreams. I'm still waiting on a few last final touches, but that will be coming out soon. So if y'all want to check that out when it is published, that will be great. I'll be starting to make more videos again soon. I've been on a little bit of a hiatus. I've just bought a new house, which I've been moving into. So I've been dealing with that. Um, in terms of final words, I think there's a lot of diversity of thought within the right. And, it's good when we come and we have these disagreements on things, which I think is important. But ultimately, but still having this sort of this propulsion and this orientation towards things like beauty and strength and power. And like I said, you know, I think that people like Bap, for instance, right, who are half Oshk and so on and so forth. You see many of these Mishlings, even in the Third Reich, many prominent, Wehrmacht and SS, never fool, but like you have a lot of Mishlings, right, who decided to adopt the German standard, and it is quite common that if a Jew joined, not generally not a full Jew, of course, but Mishlings, for instance, um, prove themselves to the Third Reich, they'd be accepted. So that was something that happened. I think that there should always be an exception to the rule when somebody proves to be the exception. So in this specific case, for example, I believe I'm trying to remember his name. It was Hitler's driver, Emil Maurice, was part Oshk. There's a few figures in the SS and so on and so forth. So I think that absolutely you get a genetic code that is influenced by culture. Um, and there absolutely is a genetic expression. But I do think that when you see exceptions, I do think that an exception should be made in these instances, and we disagree there, which is totally fine. Um, but I think like when it comes to peoples in general, right? I think it's ultimately when you look at the racial expressions over time, and what expressions is good and what expressions is bad. I think it's generally you ought to look at it from the perspective of what is going to make a people stronger and what is going to make them weaker. And of course, for example, if you look at the Spanish, right, in many Latin American countries, they essentially were absorbed into the native population and pretty much disappeared. Or if you look at, for example, many people have conquered the Han, Chinese, right? But it was never the conquerors that ended up being prominent in the future. They just got absorbed into the Han. So it's interesting all these different ways you could look at it. But I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not personally as hardcore as a lot of people are in terms of the race question. And I know you are yourself, and it's good that we have these conversations. But I think that when I look, for example, um, what do I view as bad mixing versus not? It's that is this going to create somebody who is weaker, who is stupider, who ultimately is going to be a lesser human than than one of his parents, which is the case in a lot of instances. But I think that essentially, what you see historically is that strong people, such as the Europeans or the Japanese or any of these people that conquered and colonized and so on and so forth, they represent a specific ideal, a spiritual ideal even, which is sort of the higher caste. So Vola talks about this with a higher caste of noble peoples, right? And these castes, essentially the warriors or the priestly caste, conquered, and that was this distinct code, which sort of represented their will to power. And these people who could turn that will to power and assert it onto the world were the higher people. And of course, the word Aryan comes from the word Arya, which means to be noble. So I think that my main thing that I would say specifically is that conquerors ought to be with other conquerors. People of higher pedigree ought to be with people of a higher pedigree. And, that I'm sure there'll be room for disagreement with a lot of people in the DR specifically. But yeah, that's just my final thoughts. For example, Mishima and a German, for instance, very different people from very different parts of the world, but both representing a noble character and a strong character and an embodiment of will to power. I think that people that have this animus of a higher caste and this ability to conquer and this ability to express will to power and this ability to assert beauty onto the world, these are the people who represent a different group and who together ought conquer and ought ally together. But anyway, of course, I know plenty of people would disagree with this, but that's just my thoughts. So I guess I'll close off with saying that the mission ultimately is to ensure that this world does not delve into the great ugliness of modernity, which is orchestrated by people who benefit from consumerism, materialism, and who want to take away from beauty, because the more you take away from beauty, the more that you yourself as an ugly person can say, well, it's okay to be ugly. The same way that the fat people don't want to be in the gym because they don't want to be fat. The same people that think being a colonizer is bad and being colonized is good. They never had their moment in the sun, therefore they don't want anyone to have any moment in the sun. This is the slave morality. This is ressentiment. And you as a person of a higher pedigree ought reject this and strive towards greatness and strive towards higher life. And that only happens if you accept that the ideal is beauty, power, will to power, strength, and that if you don't have it, you should be aspiring to get it. Never accept that weakness is all right. Always strive for power. And if you die in the process like Mishima did, then so be it. But yeah, long-winded. I haven't done a podcast in a while, so thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.
It really was a pleasure, and thank you for coming on. Obviously, we have some strong disagreement when it comes to that particular ethnic group, the bagel people, I'll say on YouTube, and what the correct solution would be. But I still want to thank you for coming on. I had you on because you're a tremendous scholar of Mishima. In fact, I think you've probably read more Mishima literature than I have. So I really appreciate you coming on. It's been a great episode, and I'm sure the audience has enjoyed it as well. Thank you for coming on to talk. I would recommend everyone follow my Twitter if you haven't already, and just some housekeeping for the channel. I'll be starting my Substack articles up. I currently don't have anything published, but I got some stuff in the works, and I want to expand and put some content on other platforms like Substack, like Odyssey, like Rumble. I'm still trying to do that, and I'm still trying to improve the podcast quality in terms of audio, in terms of frequency, and stuff like that. So thank you all for coming on to watch episode 2 of the podcast. Thank you to the Warrior Philosopher for generously giving us his time, and we will see you all next time.